40 pounds of cornmeal, 20 pounds of dried beans, a slab of salt pork that would last 6 months without refrigeration, a cast-iron Dutch oven, and 12 miles to the nearest neighbor. That was the pantry. That was the kitchen. That was the entire food system for a family of 4 in Kansas Territory in 1862, before the first harvest, before the general store was within reach, before the railroad changed what was possible. Everything on this list came out of those constraints. The women who made these foods did not call themselves resourceful. They called themselves fed. Number 13 on this list is the bread they made every third day before commercial yeast was available, using a leavening method so specific to temperature and timing that most professional bakers today have never heard of it. Number 4 is the preparation that required knowing which weeds were edible, and the women who knew it had learned from the indigenous and Mexican women they met along the trail, not from any cookbook. Number 1 is the POT. Everything else is what you could do if you had it. These foods did not vanish because something better replaced them. Some of them are still better than what replaced them. They vanished because the railroad arrived and made them unnecessary, and unnecessary skills do not get passed on. That is all it takes. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Let's count down the 15 forgotten foods pioneer women made that no one knows how to cook anymore. Number 15. Salt pork and beans. 3 cents a pound for the salt pork. 2 cents for the beans. 5 cents total fed a family of 4 for 2 days. That was the arithmetic of the frontier before any recipe was written. Dried beans were soaked overnight in whatever water was available: creek water, well water, muddy water if that was all there was, then combined with pieces of salt-cured pork belly and enough water to cover, and simmered for 3 hours over a campfire. What came out of the pot tasted of smoke and cured pork, and the dense warmth of protein that a body doing 12 hours of physical labor urgently needed. Salt pork and beans cost 5 cents combined per pound in 1865 at the Missouri Outfitters. There was no more efficient food produced for the American frontier. The beans took 3 hours. The salt pork took nothing. It had preserved itself for months in its own salt before it ever reached the pot. The efficiency was not a virtue the pioneer woman celebrated. It was a requirement she met every day until something better became possible. Number 14. Johnny cake. Cornmeal. Water. Salt. Fire. If you had those 4 things, you had bread. On most mornings on the trail, those were the only 4 things available. The stiff batter was pressed flat onto the greased lid of the Dutch oven or onto a smooth stone at the edge of the coals. It cooked slowly until the bottom hardened to a pale gold crust and the top dried enough to flip without breaking. A Johnny cake cost under 2 cents worth of cornmeal in 1860, and it did one thing exactly right. It kept you moving. The pale gold crust on the bottom and the dense, slightly gritty crumb inside were not impressive by any bread-making standard a person from a city would recognize. But the Johnny cake answered hunger with the same directness it had shown since the Pilgrims were eating it in New England 250 years earlier, before wheat grew there, before yeast was available, before anything more sophisticated was possible. The women on the wagon trains were not concerned with the history of the bread. They were hungry. The Johnny cake answered that. Number 13. Ash cake. No pan, no stone, no lid. You wrapped a flat round of cornmeal dough in wet corn husks, buried it directly in the hot ash of the fire, and came back 45 minutes later. The outer crust formed from contact with the ash itself, thick and slightly mineral in flavor, the same chemical reaction that gives wood-fired pizza its specific taste. The pioneer women making it in 1862 had no name for the process, but they had timing. Ash cake cost 2 cents in cornmeal in 1862 and produced something that the Johnny cake, which used the same ingredient, could not produce: a crust that was both hard and faintly smoky from the ash contact, and an interior that stayed moist inside the husk wrapper during the bake. The same cornmeal in worse conditions, no pan, no lid, direct contact with fire, produced better bread. That is almost always how it works with constraints. Constraints remove the bad options and leave only the good ones. This was not a philosophy. It was an observation made by women who had no other choice and who kept making the same bread until they understood exactly what the fire was doing to it. Number 12. Crackling bread. The fat was not the byproduct. The cracklings were. When a pioneer woman rendered lard, melting salted pork fat slowly until it separated, the golden brown solids left in the pot after straining were not discarded. They went into the next batch of cornbread batter. The result was richer, more filling, and more savory than plain cornmeal. The cracklings baked into dense pockets of crisped pork flavor distributed through the crumb, and the fat in them kept the bread moist longer than any plain version would have managed. Crackling bread cost 0 cents additional in 1865. Its only ingredient beyond the standard cornmeal batter was the byproduct of a process that was going to happen anyway. There is a category of frontier cooking where one task's waste became the next task's ingredient. Crackling bread was the purest example of it. One animal rendered completely, every part of it producing something useful. The fat for cooking, the cracklings for the bread, the salt for the curing that started the whole cycle. The frontier had a word for this economy. It was just called cooking. Number 11. Cornmeal mush. Hot from the pot, it was breakfast. Poured into a pan and left overnight to firm, it was tomorrow's breakfast. Sliced and fried in lard until the cut surfaces crisped to gold. Whatever remained after that went back into boiling water as thin gruel, or to the animals. 3 meals from one pot of cornmeal at 2 cents a pound in 1860. That calculation, cornmeal at 2 cents a pound in 1860, yielding hot mush tonight, fried mush tomorrow morning, gruel or animal feed the day after, was not a cooking technique on the frontier. It was the organizing principle of the entire food system. Every ingredient was considered not only for what it was today, but for what it would become when it was cold, when it was left over, when it had dried out. The mush was where that principle was most visible. 4 people, 1 pot, 3 days. The cornmeal cost 2 cents a pound in 1860. The calculation it enabled, 3 different meals from the same ingredient, cost nothing beyond the willingness to plan ahead. The pioneer woman planned ahead because she had no alternative. Number 10. Salt-rising bread. Walk into the homestead the morning after the starter was set, and you knew immediately whether it had worked. The smell was unmistakable, sharp, faintly cheesy, a little wrong in a way that was completely right. That smell was Clostridium perfringens at work, a bacterium occurring naturally in cornmeal or potato water kept at the right temperature overnight. It leavened bread without yeast and without baking soda through a process the pioneer women understood not by its microbiology, but by its smell, by its feel, and by what it did when the dough was ready. The bread that came from it was dense and tangy, and unlike any yeast bread. Salt-rising bread cost under 2 cents in materials in 1860, and it produced a bread that was genuinely distinct from anything else the frontier offered, sharp and dense and tangy in a way that every person who grew up eating it recognized at once. The women who could make it had paid attention at their mother's sides, not to a written recipe, but to the smell of the crock in the morning, the texture of the risen dough, the weight of it when it was ready to shape. The women who had not learned to make it made Johnny cake instead, which was fine. But it was not this. And if these pioneer hearths are taking you somewhere specific, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We have more of this fire left. Number 9. Lye hominy. 2 communities on the frontier. The ones that made lye hominy did not develop pellagra. The ones that switched to untreated dried corn for convenience did. Pellagra is a niacin deficiency disease that causes dementia, dermatitis, diarrhea, and eventually death. The lye processing, soaking dried corn in a caustic wood ash solution, simmering it for hours, and rinsing in many changes of water, removed the outer hull and unlocked the niacin in the corn kernel, making it bioavailable in a way that untreated corn's niacin was not. The women who knew this did not know it as biochemistry. They knew it as what their mothers made and what their children needed. Lye hominy cost under 2 cents in dried corn in 1860. When the process was abandoned for the convenience of just cooking dried corn directly, the pellagra came back in the communities that had abandoned it. The corn that emerged from the process was pale and swollen to nearly twice its size, soft and tender and clean tasting in a way that raw dried corn never is, the hull gone, the flavor of the grain itself concentrated and clean. The pellagra connection was not understood as biochemistry until the early 20th century. The women who maintained the old process had understood it as something their children needed the whole time, without the vocabulary for why. They did not need the science. The science needed them. Number 8. Wilted lettuce with hot bacon grease. October to April. Salt pork, dried beans, cornmeal. 5 months with no fresh green thing. Then the kitchen garden in May produced its first leaves, and the woman who had been eating nothing but brown and beige food since autumn tore the young lettuce into a bowl, added sliced green onion if there was any, added sugar and vinegar, and poured the hot bacon grease directly from the cast iron pan over all of it while it was still sizzling. The leaves wilted immediately. The dressing, fat and acid and sugar and heat, saturated everything in seconds. It was eaten at once. This preparation required no oil because there was no oil. It required hot fat because there was always fat from the morning salt pork, never discarded, always waiting in the pan. Wilted lettuce cost nothing in cash in 1860, under 1 cent in materials from what the garden and the fire already provided. It is not a recipe that anyone would invent from comfort. It could only have been invented from the specific combination of deprivation and abundance that spring on the frontier produced. 5 months of nothing green, then suddenly too much, and a cast iron pan still hot from breakfast. It invented itself from those constraints, producing something bright and sharp and briefly alive on a plate that had been brown and dense and preserved for 5 months straight. That is the whole history of it. Number 7. Pocket soup. The 1849 Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California listed it on page 1 of the provisions section. Not as a luxury, as a requirement. Beef knuckle and shin bones simmered for 12 hours. The liquid was strained and reduced again and again over low heat until it turned dark and gelatinous, and concentrated enough to pour onto a flat surface, cool to a firm slab, cut into squares, and dry until the squares rattled when shaken. 1 square dissolved in hot water on the trail became a cup of broth that could sustain a person through a cold night. Pocket soup cost under 10 cents in bones and fuel in 1850, and it produced something the wagon train could not have survived certain stretches without. The bouillon cube that eventually replaced it is a reasonable industrial approximation of the principle. What it does not approximate is the 12-hour reduction made from specific bones in specific water by a specific woman who knew when it was done because she had made it before, and remembered what done looked like, and smelled like, and felt like when she pressed the cooled slab between her fingers. That knowledge was not written down. It traveled in hands. Number 6. Parched corn. Lewis and Clark carried it in 1804 after Mandan women taught them how to make it. The Lakota and Dakota had been making it for centuries before that. You make it by putting dried field corn into a dry cast iron skillet and shaking it constantly over heat until the skin of each kernel splits. The starch toasts to amber, and the kitchen smells like something between popcorn and toasted grain. It can be eaten dry, or ground and mixed with water, or soaked overnight to soften. It contained enough protein and starch to sustain a person walking 20 miles a day. In tougher conditions, a pound of parched corn could sustain someone for 15 miles of travel where no fire was possible and no time was available to cook. In 1860, parched corn cost 2 cents per pound of dried field corn already in the wagon. The golden, slightly smoky, lightly crunchy result was portable, shelf-stable, and versatile. The real skill was sensory, the right temperature, the right motion, the smell that told you amber instead of burnt. That knowledge traveled west without attribution. The ingredients were native. The knowledge was native. The credit was not given. Number 5. Fried mush. The mush from last night was cold and firm in its pan. That was not a problem. That was the starting point. Sliced half an inch thick, each piece was dredged lightly in cornmeal and placed in a cast iron skillet in hot lard. 4 minutes without touching it. The bottom crust developed slowly, first pale, then gold, then deep amber. Flipped once. The second side followed. What came out was crisp on both faces and soft and slightly sweet in the center, and it was genuinely better than the porridge it had started as. Fried mush cost 0 cents additional in 1860. The cast iron produced the crust. Without the cast iron, this was warm mush on a cold surface that stuck and tore and produced nothing worth eating. With the cast iron, the even heat and the seasoned surface did what they always do. They produced a crust. The crust was thin and crisp and gold, slightly sweet from the toasted cornmeal, and the interior behind it stayed soft and creamy from the original mush. 2 textures from the same pot of leftover cornmeal, one from what it had been, one from what the cast iron made it. Number 4. Wild greens pot. The survival line on the frontier was not money. It was botany. The women who knew which weeds were edible, like lamb's quarters, dandelion greens, purslane, wild mustard, and watercress, had learned it from the indigenous, Mexican, and black women they encountered along the trail, in trading posts and river crossings, and the places where the routes intersected. The women who came straight from eastern cities and had never been taught to read a landscape as a food source looked at the same ground and saw nothing. Lamb's quarters, washed and placed in the Dutch oven with salt pork and water, were cooked down until wilted, dark, and savory, and served with the bitter pot liquor drunk from a cup. The Dutch oven held the heat and the flavor. Wild greens pot cost 0 cents in 1865 beyond the salt pork already in the pot. The dark, savory pot liquor drunk from a cup alongside was as nutritious as anything else on the frontier table. The knowledge gap between the women who knew the landscape and the women who did not was a caloric gap, sometimes a survival gap. A grocery store eventually replaced that knowledge in the communities that gained access to one. But a grocery store requires a road. On the frontier, especially in the early years, there was often no road. Number 3. Saleratus biscuits. Before baking powder was sold commercially, before any general store was within 2 days' travel, there was Saleratus, potassium bicarbonate found naturally in deposits throughout the American West, and the knowledge that combining it with an acidic liquid made dough rise. Not slowly, like yeast. Immediately. which meant the woman who was making biscuits had, from the moment she added the buttermilk to the moment the Dutch oven lid went on to capture the gas before it escaped. She learned that timing by failing at it first. Everyone did. Saleratus biscuits cost under 3 cents a batch in 1855 and produced a lighter, more tender, golden-crusted bread than anything achievable with cornmeal alone, the inside soft and slightly flaky, the outside just crisp enough to hold together when split. The American biscuit descends from this, directly, in every form it has ever taken. Every Southern biscuit, every fast food biscuit, every biscuits and gravy plate in every diner in the country. All of it traces back to a woman on the frontier who understood that acid plus alkali made something rise, and that she had about 45 seconds to get the dough into the Dutch oven before the gas was gone. The Saleratus biscuit came first. Number 2. Sage cheese. In May, the dairy cow freshened, and the milk came in faster than 4 people could drink it. The milk was fresh and abundant. 2 gallons a day, then 3. The question was not whether to make cheese, but how fast to start. Whole milk warmed to body temperature in the Dutch oven. Rennet from a dried calf stomach was stirred in and left undisturbed for an hour, until the curds formed and separated cleanly from the whey. The curds were gathered in cloth. Fresh sage leaves from the kitchen garden were pressed through with salt. The bundle was weighted and left to drain for 12 hours. What came out was white and crumbly, and sharp with the herbal bite of the sage. It tasted exactly of the farm it came from. The specific grass the cow had been eating, the specific variety of sage growing along the fence. Sage cheese cost under 5 cents for rennet and salt in 1870. There is no version of that traceability available at any price in any grocery store. The cow is still giving milk. The sage is still growing. That specific cheese is not available because the knowledge of how to make it died with the last generation that needed to. Number 1. The Dutch oven. Her husband said it weighed 12 pounds, and 12 pounds was 12 pounds they could not afford on the wagon. She said 12 pounds was the difference between eating and not eating. She won. 3 legs so it could stand over coals without tipping. A flanged lid held coals on top, so heat came from above and below simultaneously. Cast iron thick enough to hold temperature evenly. It was the closest thing to a brick oven a campfire could produce. In that pot were the salt pork and beans, the Johnny cakes on the upturned lid, the ash cake in the fire, the crackling bread, the cornmeal mush, the Saleratus biscuits, the sage cheese, and the pocket soup at its long reduction. Everything on this list. The Dutch oven cost between $3 and $5 at the Missouri Outfitters in 1862. Today, it is sold as camping equipment or fashionable cookware. The pot survived. What did not survive was the knowledge of what it could do in the hands of a woman who fed her family from it for a year with no alternative. Knowledge was lost. The smell of the lid when the heat was right. The sound of the beans when they were done. All of that, accumulated across years, was what made it work. The pot was the instrument. She was the instrument too. It was remarkable. The great-granddaughter of a woman who crossed the Missouri in 1862 lives in Topeka. She has the Dutch oven. It sits on a shelf. She has never cooked in it. Make one of these this week. The Johnny cake needs 4 ingredients and a hot surface. The wilted lettuce needs bacon grease, still hot from the pan, and something fresh from the garden. The fried mush needs last night's leftover polenta, a cast iron pan, and patience enough not to touch it for 4 minutes. Tell me the name of the woman in your family who knew how to cook from almost nothing, because some of you know that name. And that name is the whole point of this list.